The work session of the Annapolis City Council for Thursday, July 25th, will be called to order at 3 p.m. This time, please join us for the invocation of Pledge of Allegiance. Sorry. Mr. City Attorney, please present today's item.
Yes, sir. The first and only item on the agenda today is ID 12224, working relationship between the Housing Authority of the City of Annapolis and the City of Annapolis. Presenters, Planning and Zoning Department staff.
Welcome, Director Jakubiak. How you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing well. How are you?
Great, thanks.
Good. So I shall get started.
Yes, please.
Okay. It's good to be here with you all today, and I won't let the opportunity pass to again say thank you. I've not been here a year yet, but I've really immersed myself into the city and its government and the issues of planning and zoning, and still enjoy coming to work every day. And this topic here that we're talking today is so vital. There's such a interesting land use and public policy aspect to this, but there's also a really deep human element to this, a profound element, and it's wrapped into the history of the city. And I was really moved recently in reading letters from average citizens who send emails and letters to the Housing Authority asking for a spot on the waiting list and imploring them for speed and getting into an available unit. And these are typically families, moms and dads with small kids who are living in untenable situations. And they describe it in ways that are quite remarkable and moving. So it reinforces for me how important the work of our department is, and how important it is to kind of get these things right and be here for you, so you can have the best information available to make these big decisions. And the decision that prompted this meeting related to a bill that would have called upon HACA to consider receivership or advance the idea of receivership at the HACA. And when I saw that, I actually spoke to a number of members of the council and certainly to the mayor and his staff, and urged a little caution, candidly, on that topic, partly because I didn't necessarily think that that would be productive in achieving the longer-term goal of redevelopment, repositioning, which is the national model that Annapolis is on board with now. But also because I wanted a chance first to tell you about what work we are doing in planning and zoning and how we've changed our way of going about doing things in response to HACA's challenges, and are trying to be a real ally and partner with HACA and its executive director and staff to address these issues. And I know we have a shared understanding about the properties. There are the four major properties still within the public housing model. Generally, the units are obsolete. You only have to think about the own house you live in and how many times it's been remodeled since it was first built, and how the major facilities have been updated, not to mention appliances and those normal things like bathroom and kitchen remodels, but structural changes that have happened over time. These aspects of home ownership apply to any real estate, and they especially apply to rental real estate. And we have obsolete housing, generally speaking, that is undercapitalized, has been for decades. And that therein lies a major challenge. It has been said that the inspection process has been onerous on the Housing Authority. it has been difficult for the Housing Authority to manage that inspection process. Fair point. The inspection process is challenging, and it's meant to be so that we are assuring a quality living environment for all residents within the city. That's applied equally to all housing units. So it's meant to be rigorous and strict. But there are special issues with obsolete, undercapitalized housing. And you know, these 4 properties within HACA are existing outside of the main thrust of housing policy in the United States, which favors the transition or repositioning into a public-private model. We're not there yet with these 4 properties, and the process is moving forward. But these legacy housing units exist with substantial problems. And those are Blueberry Square, Robinwood, Harbor House, and Eastport Terrace. So we're talking about roughly 550 housing units that are in this transition, a sort of no man's land of transition, not worth the investment in full-scale redevelopment, and yet people are living there and have to live there for a period of time while the transition happens to the voucher program or the Section 8 of the Federal Housing Act. So we're in a period of transition. There are 550 units that are caught into this inspection regime, and that has prompted a great deal of coordination between my office and the Office of the Executive Director of HACA. And it was about 6 months or 6 weeks after I was hired. It was beginning of November, I think I had my first sit-down meeting with Melissa Maddox Evans, where we began to discuss the inspection process and the things that she pointed out could be improved with respect to the inspection process. And that meeting was very informative. I got a deeper understanding. Teresa Wellman was informing me and educating me about the long-term issues, came back to the Planning and Zoning Department and attempted to make some changes that I thought would be beneficial. But I didn't fully understand the complexity of the issues back then, and maybe none of us at the staff fully understood. And I went back to HACA and had another sit-down meeting, including a tour of units at HACA's properties at Harbor House, and I met with her and her staff. And it became more apparent the kind of the real fiscal issues, the financial issues that imperil the housing situation for these 550 units, or you could say 550 families that live in the properties. So I realized we needed to make some more profound changes. And I was in the midst of that when the executive director came to a meeting with the mayor and key staff and the law office and some others, and said, laid it out. And then that meeting was followed up with a letter to the editor, really laying out the dire straits that she believed that the housing authority is in. So that prompted me to accelerate our approach. In coordination with the mayor's office, we started making some changes right away. We had already made a number of changes, and I'll get to those, but the most significant change was to promote a housing inspector within our department to a new position, and this was generally expedited through the HR process. She now manages the inspections and licensing regime for all of HACA's properties and for any other affordable housing property within the city's jurisdiction. It just so happens that this person was a gem within our office that I hadn't seen, being a relatively newcomer. She was spending a lot of time traveling to George Washington University while working full-time, getting a master's degree in public administration with a focus on housing. Imagine that. We were cultivating a future leader right here in the department. And so I moved her into this role, and it's been phenomenal. The coordination and the day-to-day interaction that she's having with the staff at HACA has been really remarkable. And that, coupled with the changes I made early on when I first realized we could make some changes, has resulted in some really meaningful improvements. And I'm going to kind of go through some data to give you a sense of what it is. But first, the main change we made, or I made in, I think it was November or somewhere before Christmas, was to increase the amount of time that any owner of a rental property would have to come into compliance with any inspections. In other words, we extended the time for we began to notify people 120 days before their license would expire. And that was important because it gives managers, property owners, HACA, more time to file their application, get their money together, file their application, schedule inspections, allow us to conduct the inspections, and then come back and repair anything that's required to meet the inspections for those units that failed, and then to schedule a re-inspection, and then to get the final license. And so we've made that change. And the first, and that change has been in effect now since about January. The first major property, which is a HUD property or HACA property, Robinwood, that has gone through that new process, is gone very smoothly. In May, the notice went out to HACA. In June, the application was filed. By the end of June, we were doing our inspections. They had to, because of the issues locally on the property, we had to extend that into July, but all the inspections were done by the first week of July. 70 units passed the inspection, but 76 units did not pass the inspection. So we knew as of the first week of July that 76 did not pass. So that means we have roughly from all of July, all of August until September 1st, because September 1st is the expiration date, roughly 60 days, almost 60 days to remedy the issues. So it worked out. We gave HACA plenty of time to make the changes, to fix the holes, repair the switches, do the things that are necessary to pass the inspection. So the process worked out really well. The challenge now for HACA, and this is the kind of fundamental issue, is they have to make those changes. And they have, they've had about 60 days, or they will have, and we all collectively, the folks at HACA and our staff, don't anticipate they'll be able to get all 76 of those units licensed in time. So some of those will lapse. Their licenses will lapse, but we are making progress. There's going to be fewer lapsed licenses than last year. And I want to say this to you, that our new approach is timely. It's delivering results, and it's providing the property owners with sufficient time. The issue at HACA right now is that it does not have the resources to hire the contractors and the staff to make the changes that are necessary to comply with the city's inspections. And that's the issue of substantial concern, because if the units are not licensed and we are following our code, those units are not necessarily generating income for HACA through the rent payments. Now, I'll say they are generating income through the housing subsidy through HUD, but the rental payments from the individual property, individual occupants are not forthcoming. I guess I want to put that into context. This is a substantial change from the way things were before. There's been, I think, fair criticism from HACA that the inspection process has not always been timely in our dealings with them. And sure enough, I did the research and looked at the data, and it's quite frequently over the past 4 years or so, not all the time, where our inspectors would not actually inspect a property until after the expiration, the license expired. So, you're just setting them up to have unlicensed units. It wasn't always the case, and there are obviously extenuating circumstances like miscommunication or inspectors setting up scheduling, then the scheduling had to be bumped back. There's no one individual entity to blame, but the city, in fact, had an inspection process that didn't always work out well because we were just too aggressive with our timing. By extending it to 120 days, it's worked out. And so that process, I think, will, over the next several years, generate more dividends and bringing more units into compliance with our inspection schedule. Jeanette Roeder, she's the staff person that we promoted. She joins me each week in a meeting with HACA, and so does Denise Rufkin in our office. The three of us, and before that, Teresa Wellman too, have been meeting with HACA weekly to discuss not only broader policies of housing, affordability, and repositioning the properties and CNI and things like that, but the day-to-day difficulties and challenges and strategy that has to be employed to get inspectors and our inspectors and the city's or the HACA's maintenance staff into alignment so they arrive at the same time and they're doing their things seamlessly, so there's not a lot of time between the two. And it's really worked out well. So those meetings have been very productive. They've also been very helpful for me to understand better the complexities of managing a public housing portfolio within a HUD framework that doesn't respect that approach anymore. And the focus now is and has been on the public-private Section 8 approach. So it's been very difficult, and but it's been a real learning experience for our staff and for myself. One thing that we began doing right away when Jeanette was promoted was to prepare a plan for working with HACA. And that, in essence, that plan prioritized units within three major categories: level 1, level 2, and level 3. With the mission of bringing into compliance as many units as possible, as quickly as possible. So we wanted to get unlicensed units licensed right away. And the strategy was to go after the easiest ones first, level 1. And so back in May 9th, when we first began this effort, there were 144 unlicensed occupied units at HACA's 4 properties, 144 unlicensed occupied. People were living there, but without the license. There were also 30 vacant units that were unlicensed. So there was a total of 174 unlicensed units among the 550 total as of May 9th. Quickly, that number began dropping down as we had this intensive effort, such that by, let's call it middle of June, we were down to 118 unlicensed occupied units. And by July the 10th, we were down to 115. So we moved from 144 to 115 unlicensed occupied units. In terms of the vacant units, we went from 30 down to 18. All in all, we moved from 174 unlicensed units to 133. So that was a reduction of 41. So 41 more units got their license and can now begin collecting rents. 12 of those were vacant and are now licensed. So 12 more units came online. Now, you might say, well, that's a lot of time, May. I mean, it's not a lot of progress. In fact, I hoped there would be more progress. But what we quickly found was that it was easy at first. The numbers came down real quick in the first couple of weeks because they were the level 1 items. There were situations where there was some housekeeping issues, or the fire, the smoke detector had been disabled. Doors were ajar, windows were cracked, things that could be fixed fairly quickly with the HACA staff that existed. But then we got into more complicated projects, which are costly, and that's where things slow down. So we haven't had any progress in these numbers for about 30 days or so. And we were making progress every week. So things have slowed down for us. And there's the two complications. One, we're into the more difficult, challenging units, which are more expensive and require contractors to do work. And two, the HACA staff are occupied with the normal maintenance of operating a portfolio of 500 units. Like, it's summertime, so HVAC issues start happening. And someone's got to go out there and fix the air conditioning units. And so the focus has been shifted. There was also a period of time where we couldn't get access to units because the occupants obstructed the access by HACA staff and the inspectors. So we couldn't complete the inspections just because occupants wouldn't let us in. And that was 9 units within Robinwood. So that was, we had to have the animal control come and assist to deal with dogs, and we actually even contacted the Annapolis Police Department. But as it turns out, they didn't have to travel there with us. But that happens from time to time, and it signals that it's not always a very cooperative relationship between the residents and the city doing the inspectors, and sometimes that itself keeps properties from being licensed. So we've made a lot of progress, but we've come to a point where progress is going to be slowed due to the natural cycle of keeping a housing portfolio active and maintained, and because there's not enough resources to deal with these issues. And that brings me to what we had contemplated some time ago, and that was a grant from the city to HACA to shore up this deficiency. And that would be $500,000. And why $500,000? Was because that money had been set aside already in another housing program. And it was advocated by Alderman Gay, not this past budget cycle, but the previous cycle, and for fiscal year 2024, it was $500,000 to be set aside for direct grants to private apartment owners so that they could use city grants to rehab their own apartments and improve them, and presumably then make it more livable for the occupants. And that was a challenging idea to operationalize, but Teresa Wellman did it, and she went through a program and a management structure and a memorandum of agreement, and she worked with this various standing committees that were necessary and got it established, and the money got allocated to a fund, but it was never spent. So that money was there. It was for housing. It was for rental housing. It was for improving rental housing conditions for occupants. It seemed like a reason. I said, Teresa, why don't we target that funding as a resource? Because we all acknowledge that we've got this financial issue. And the mayor said, let's move it along. And one of the assistant city attorneys began in coordination with Teresa to draft a basic memorandum of understanding to provide some guardrails about how the fund would be used and provide some oversight to ensure that the city knew that the money contributed would result in measurable improvements and help us get more properties licensed. Or broadly speaking, allow HACA to make other important changes to keep the properties livable for the residents. So that's where we are now. We have a draft grant agreement or memorandum of understanding. It's not been signed. It went through began going through the review process. Mike Malinoff, myself, Ashley, Ashley Leonard and Mike Laus all had a chance to look at it, but it's still now, I believe, actually on hold because it was determined that we needed to get the city council to at least be aware of this formally and publicly and make some kind of decision like that is an appropriate use of that money because it wasn't the specific intention of the money. Alderman Gay has been briefed on it and gave his blessing to its use, but it hadn't received any formal city council review. The progress we've made so far is really important, and there are other changes that could be forthcoming too. We would imagine working more closely with HACA in this way to anticipate problems and if there's funding to repair, to be more assertive about saying, okay, let's go in, let's take on these larger issues right away and help them strategize about where it makes the biggest bang for the buck to get units back in line. For instance, when a unit is vacant for a period of time, I think it's roughly 3 to 6 months, then HACA loses the federal subsidy for that unit, which is substantial. So each year it has to kind of provide information showing what units are occupied and which are not. Those that are not occupied, that are vacant, lose funding, and that is substantial. So naturally then we'd want to get as many units as possible that are vacant licensed, and HACA would then have to get them occupied. There is the CNI project, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that because that's an element to all of this, and it's a enhanced way of redeveloping Eastport Terrace and Harbor House. It's not the only way. More streamlined version of that would not follow the transformation plan that the city and HACA worked on. It would be HACA going through the redevelopment process in the same way it's done with the other projects in its previous portfolio. And it's doing a redevelopment or kind of redevelopment / rehabilitation with Robinwood now. It hires a developer and it structures a financing deal and goes forward. But the CNI provides substantial amount of public benefit because it's not just a housing development. It's not a redevelopment. It's a city development event. It's a city redevelopment event. It's a neighborhood level type of reimagining. And as you probably have seen the transformation plan, and it was endorsed by HUD, and it would lead to the crafting of an implementation plan, which would presumably get a substantial grant from HUD. A matching grant would require a city to make some contributions of land and resources and time and perhaps even cash. But those that layered funding deal would have to be put together relatively soon. That work has to begin. And in fact, given that there is some time constraints on this, I've invited HACA and her key financial staff to come to meet with the senior team and senior staff team in the planning and zoning department So our entire staff is aware of what's necessary. We can then begin to support the city council and advise the mayor's office about what does a implementation grant that is in the city's interest look like. We want to represent and bring to bear the concerns that we have, hear what they have to propose, and understand what they've done in the city elsewhere, what nationally CNI projects have done, and they're bringing in an expert consultant on CNI and housing finance too to meet with us. In other words, we feel we need to develop our expertise in housing at a high level to be a real advocate and supporting force for the council in dealing with the CNI, and that's what we're doing. Which I'm sort of signaling to you is that, and this may be reinforcing some of the messaging that Melissa Maddox Evans gave the last time she sat here. It was last week, I think, in that work session, a week before. She used the word partnership or partnering or coordination or supporting multiple times. And in fact, that's what we are doing. We're not any legal partner with HACA, but we're really trying to work together, because if the redevelopment of these major parts of the city is going to be successful, there needs to be a lot of coordination between our staff and HACA, and that's what we're trying to do. And we really, frankly, I feel I have a very good working relationship with the executive director, and we have a lot of success recently to build on. Now, if this goes into a receivership model, I think a lot of that is going to be changed substantially. And I don't know how a developer reacts to a receivership situation when they need to sit down with HACA and the city to do the CNI project. It may, in fact, mean that the properties redevelop under a different type of approach. Or it may extend the time at which it takes to redevelop them. And I'm here to give you the sense that we can't extend that any further. Redevelopment is so important. And the sooner the better, actually. And having said that, the CNI project is not something that can result in new occupancy right away. It will be many years. And conceivably, through the phasing, it may take 5 to 9 years before the entire project is totally done, meaning that this coordination effort that we built has to continue over a period of time. And I'll stop right there for any questions.
Thank you. So Alderman Finlayson had a hand up first, and Alderman Arnett.
To my correct sheet. I'm taking notes on different subjects. Anyway, my question was going to be whether there are levels of inspection. I'm focusing on those that didn't meet the standard, weren't not able to make the corrections, so they couldn't get the license. So you mentioned some of them had minor problems and others had major problems. Is there a plan to move those with the minor problems into the license category? And I'm talking about moving people around, actually.
Oh.
And maybe that's a HACA question, their interest. But how much sway do we have in convincing them to do what is needed?
I don't know that we have a lot of sway in that, like moving people around, but we can actually think about where we invest our inspection time and resources. And if there's funding that's brought to the table, I think we have a little more sway in the sense that because we can set some performance standards that might lead to that outcome, within that memorandum of understanding. But it may be a stretch to involve the CD, the Department of Planning and Zoning, in that direct involvement. That's almost an operational issue that think just by the nature of our different entities, we wouldn't engage at that level of operational decision-making.
You mentioned people paying rent.
Yeah.
Do they make that as a requirement when they are licensed? And I know we do the licensing, but, I know one of the big problems is people aren't paying the rent.
Yes.
And so they don't have their monies to pay to do the renovations that are needed. So are they using some sort of mechanism to make sure that people begin to pay their rents and then they're able, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there's like any tenant, there's a lease agreement or an agreement with the Public Housing Authority that requires conformance with all the conditions, including paying rent. But they collect less than 50% of the rent that's due each month on average. Last month, June, was the worst they've had for a while when they've only collected 28% of the rent roll. As a matter of fact, and it's hard to say, but folks generally don't pay rent. Even when the license has been delivered and the unit has become licensed and the logic of not paying rent has been removed, the experience has been that they are still not collecting rent from owners, and it's only until a judge says you have to pay rent that folks are meeting their obligations to pay rent, even when the rent is a relatively small amount in context of what we would consider small. So it's been difficult. And there are some principal reasons to that. Principally, as I am beginning to understand, it's because of the judiciary at the district court level has not been particularly favorable to the housing authority in the various proceedings that go to the district court.
Well, I'm glad to hear, I lost that other question for me, but I'm glad to hear that the money is set aside for assistance. And I wasn't clear whether we would be managing or did Ms. Wellman put a protocol in place to make sure that that money will be used expressly for the renovations or
The draft agreement, if in fact the city initiated this, the draft agreement in its draft form now would provide oversight, would essentially have periods of time for performance, the distribution of the funds in tranches, the first one maybe perhaps $100,000, and then demonstration of progress, and then the release of the second one. But how you structure that is something that the law office will guide us on, because the closer that it's easy to fall into this notion of intermingling interest and operational matters, and that's not something that we want to do. They're two separate entities, one established under federal law, one's a city municipal corporation. So we have to keep that separation there. But in any case, there will be a performance approach. There would be oversight. And we have the staff already, Denise Ruffkins has done this for her whole career, has tracked these types of things. So we would actually imagine her being involved in the review of invoicing and actually in coordination with Jeanette, who's doing the inspections. There would be enough oversight to ensure that the funds were used properly.
Would it make sense, or was it considered that we would hire the contractors and have them do the work?
That's not what this anticipates, the draft agreement.
Okay. That's not an option then. Okay, thank you.
On my net.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As we waited, the number of things have piled up. We have a text from Alderman Gay saying, wait, I only agreed to 250,000, not 500.
Oh.
So, but I'm surprised 500 is even enough. I mean, part of the problem that the Housing Authority, and I have been paying close attention and going to the meetings, is that they keep getting further and further behind on their capital, and they've dug themselves, or they've been put in a very deep hole. And I think we need to be mindful of where we find this money, but I think I would say for myself, if there were similar difficulties going on at Harbor House or Nautilus Point, I think the city would pay attention and try to address that. And these are city residents and people who I think need more help than most. So we need to figure out how much money they need and how much money we can help. I would note in passing that you changed your policy, but the Office of Law has been driving the city council to take things out of code and put them into rules and regulations, and we passed an ordinance agreeing to that with the proviso that these kinds of policy changes would be run by the Rules Committee. And I think there have been a lot of policy changes made by a lot of departments that are not coming to rules. And there was also agreed that all of the current policies and procedures that are not available online would be put online. This isn't on you alone, but it is my objection at the time to this getting things out of code and putting them in rules and regulations. And what it really means is if that had come to rules, that would have been a very important communication tool. I'm sure we would have agreed with it. Makes a lot of sense to me. I think it's very proactive. But we would have known about that a few months ago instead of finding out about it today. So this isn't directed at you specifically, but I think it is directed at if we're going to change the way we're doing things and take things out of code, then we ought to follow the process that we set up so that the council is aware. The Rules Committee cannot change a rule or procedure, but we can change the overriding ordinances or code that affect them, so we could in fact bring back a change. I doubt we would have done it with this, but I think the more important loss here is that whole communication opportunity. So I want to thank you for being proactive and progressive, but you know, no good deed goes unpunished. You know that by now. I am very interested. I've heard for a long time, and when I attended the CNI development things, this magic of including mixed income in the process has a dramatic effect in really changing the culture in the housing developments. They're now voucher developments, they're not public housing, and they're public-private. But I guess I would really, if there's some synopsis that shows how and why it does that, I've heard as little as 5% of the residents being at full market makes this huge difference. And I'm glad that there's some magic fairy dust that can make that happen. I think it's probably worth 25 sworn officers in terms of improving public safety, but more importantly, improving the quality of life in the housing itself. So if that's something, I bet you Eric Lashinsky volumes on this.
There's actually an article in the Wall Street Journal today, of all
Is that
places,
right?
on this topic, documenting a study that was just done by, I think it was a Harvard economist, housing person, that documented the long-term outcomes for children who grow up in communities where there is a preponderance of employment, where not their parents are necessarily gainfully employed, but they're in and among a community where there's the general notion is that people are waking up every morning going to work, even though they themselves may be poor and in families that are not working. And that's, you know, it's an academic study that's been done, but supports, again, is that theory that's been promulgated since the 70s, actually, that children do better when they're in a diverse community of people that are of all income areas and groupings.
So the last thing I wanted to talk about, and I thought we had a very good dialogue with the planning department and with the housing authority at our work session, and then with some of the council committees. But this partnership, this full partnership needs, I think, more definition. Because the cost to do the redevelopment, the low number I heard from Melissa Maddox Evans was 300 million. That's in addition to the 50 million if we win the CNI money. And I've heard numbers up to 450 million. And we are talking about a lot of housing. I don't know what the cost per unit of 722 units would be, but we're not talking about chump change, and particularly since I think we're not just talking about putting units back, but we're putting units back where they're located to have views of water and things like that, making a better quality community, which adds more cost. And is the expectation that the things that the city is contributing in kind, in terms of services and in land, if we can get the Spa Road remediated or some other facility, waiving fees in lieu, those things are the extent of our commitment, or is there some notion that we're partnering on the $300 to $400 million in financing the redevelopment?
Yeah, that's yet to be determined, but I would imagine it's going to be like that. It's going to involve the city, perhaps the county, the state, and the private developer. So it's not just the city and sort of HACA with this relationship with the developer. And all those in-kind contributions have real value and contribute to matching those federal dollars. But that $300,000, $400,000, I mean, that's the cost of development. And a lot of that is borne by the private sector, who will take ownership of those properties, a majority stake in the ownership, of course. So it's okay to be intimidated initially by the number, but it's wrong to say that number is so high that it's not worth the effort to figure out the details, because that is not a number that's all public dollars at all. And it's not all dollars, first of all, but it's certainly not all public monies. But the question, is there a cash element to this? And I think that's something for us to think about. We're going to have to think about that. And the question is, but for the cash, where are we? It may be that some aspects of the project don't go forward, or it doesn't go forward in the current configuration or the plan. But those issues will have to be thought through entirely in a detailed way.
Yeah, but this feels a lot like you're traveling abroad and you jump into a cab and there's no meter there, and the driver says, well, I'll tell you what it costs when we get there, kind of thing. If there is an expectation of dollars from the city treasury that are actually going to be dollars not in kind contributing to this redevelopment, I think we need to know pretty soon what that expectation is. So
keeping with your analogy, we're still at home on the internet deciding what city we're going to visit. Your analogy, and so we haven't figured out what the cost are.
Vicky,
so
Vicky, I will recognize you. Please let us finish. Thank you. I'll recognize you. Yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted to make that point. We're still in early days.
I'm saying that we can only go so long. My understanding from Melissa was the resolution we passed with the amendments, which I think all made it better, was something that was needed to show HUD that we are a very involved party, that we are approving this initiative. Remember, support versus approve, that whole dialogue. And so we have, but we still are not sure what it is that we've approved in terms of expectations of financial commitment from the city. And at some point, we're going to need to know that. And our constituents are going to need to know that.
Assistant City Manager wants to weigh in.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out in the proposal that was submitted to HUD, the city's involvement was listed within that in primarily in the in-kind side around investments that the city already has on the books for public infrastructure and things like that. And obviously we have a CIP project already labeled for CNI. I am not aware at this time of any other commitments, and certainly there were none listed within the application to HUD beyond what has already been discussed as part of the budgeting process in terms of cash.
But you use the word primarily, which to me connotes more than 50%. But not all, it's just primarily. So at some point, and I think we owe this to the Housing Authority, I think we need to be honest with the executive director what kind of financial support, if the public-private partnership, say, only is able to pony up $250 million, and the redevelopment costs are $350 million, some of which can be in kind, but some of which are dollars. We need to know that price tag at some point here before we commit, and we'll have to know where that money will come from. I didn't mean to end on a downer because I have to thank you for your presentation. You know I like the way you started off, and I think you're doing a lot of very proactive things, and I really do believe the things you're doing ought to lower the temperature level, the anxiety level that had been built up. I think there was some real, there were shouting matches between factions, and I'm hoping because of what you're doing, that's in the past, and we're going to really have a good partnership.
Right. I can assure that we're at the staff level, and the reason I'm involving all our senior staff is that it's going to take some creative thinking and some pushback and dialogue and debate. But I can assure you that other jurisdictions have dealt with housing in innovative ways too. And I have written programs that are funded through annexation agreements, where developers seeking the benefit of city zoning and city water and sewer make contributions to a city's affordable housing program.
Yeah.
No cost to city residents, no cost to the tax base. But there's what's wrong with that? And they gladly do it because they know the value of annexation is substantial. So there are a lot of possibilities here to close the gap if the gap has to be closed. And we're going to think through them all, make sure. Yeah, so.
Thank you, Alderman Tierney, then Alderman Savage.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sorry it took you so long to get there.
No, it's fine. I've never really had the opportunity to explain the reason for the receivership resolution. So if I just may, first I want to thank you, and I want to thank you for your opening statement. Yes, I have to confess that this, I don't know what you want to call it, this situation kind of leaves me brokenhearted, especially, leaving. I mean, I look back and I can say that the mayor has brought Annapolis to a greater place, and with One Annapolis and all of the other things that he has done, but we won't be whole as a city. We won't be whole as a city until we fix this situation, until we elevate those residents to a living condition that they feel part of the city. And it's like the hole in the middle. And on a positive note, I feel very strongly that the CNI is where all of our effort should be. You opened up your statement with the current situation, which was really reiterated in the whereas clauses of this receivership resolution. There, we have an obsolete inventory, we have an imperiled fiscal structure, we have a loss of federal subsidy, we have no resources to comply with the current code to make the repairs. HUD doesn't respect this experiment anymore. So those are the givens, right? And then, of course, we've gotten mixed messages from from Melissa, and she, she has come here and said she has no resources, we need to help, and not very happy about it. So the receivership model was based on all of those givens, like what do we do? And we need money. And it wasn't to sell the property or all that scary stuff that receivership usually brings up. It was to bring back a fiscal structure so that money could flow in and we could fix these properties, specifically these 4. But what I have since, and this was a model that was used in Washington, D.C. successfully, and you know all of that, and we have talked, but the problem with the present situation is that HUD is like this, sorry guys, that's it. So here we are with this, and it is a good word, obsolete inventory. So this brings me to, and the other thing I discovered with the receivership model is that if our focus is on the CNI project and a private-public partnership, then us having this would not, I assume, would not look good, for lenders or what have you. At the same time, I don't know what this obsolete inventory looks like to lenders. I'm going to give you money here, but you've got this going on. So it leads me to my question, which is, what is the end game here? I feel like this is all great, I understand, but it's like you're putting these units, terrible analogy, but sort of on life support, Okay, you're putting them on life support, $500,000, and that equates to about $4,500 a unit for the ones that are problems. You fix them, maybe not, they pay rent. What do we do next year, and the year after that, and the year after that? Right. What is our end game with these properties? And that's coming from my background, my civil engineering. You drive around those neighborhoods and they're cardboard. They're not viable structures anymore. So ultimately they have to be replaced.
Yeah.
And you can't say that publicly. It scares people. Yeah. But they can't continue to live in those conditions. Right. So so those four properties ultimately have to be, in another scary word, redeveloped into housing that again will elevate them to a living condition that they deserve. Right. That's so it's a lot of money, and I think we can't. And that was the reason for the receivership, model was, where's this money coming from? We need it. And so your presentation is sort of that, in a way, we're going to handle the money. Notice that we're not giving it to them to manage, we're handling it, and I appreciate that. So I have 3 questions, so maybe you can answer them. I'll sort of all at once. Well, number 1 was, what is the end game? Okay. And on the units that are coming online, are they paying rent? And then how does this all operate among the legal stuff, restrictions, that stuff that we don't know much about, and I don't know how far we can go in talking about it.
Sure.
Do you know where I'm headed here?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So the end game, there are 4 properties. 2 of them are in the process of redevelopment already.
Right.
Robinwood and
Morris Plum.
no, well, Morris Plum, yes.
But that, yeah, that's,
Bloomsbury Square, sorry. So of the 2, the Robinwood is more trouble in terms of its
Yeah.
conditions. So that's there's a developer on board now by the year 2028 that should be ready to go, occupied in substantially rehabbed units, transitioned to the private sector, operating under the Section 8 program of federal law, not Section 9 public housing. The conversion will have been completed. The end game is in sight.
is Section
essentially-
8 still viable? I mean, it's
Yeah.
that, okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Section 8 contains a variety of programmatic initiatives, and including a project-based voucher, which is tied to the property, and a property-based voucher. So the end game is that. The end game for Eastport Terrace and Harbor House is the CNI program. If not CNI, then a similar type of redevelopment, but as Robinwood, but it'd be substantial removal and rebuilding because the units are not able to be, as far as I can tell, rehabbed. We're talking about a redevelopment there. Hopefully it's CNI and that we can go through this process. So to make it clear, it's not as if the CNI project turns on in 1 year and it's finished the next. It's going to be multi-year phasing. That means that no one has to come to the table with $300,000 or $400,000 in 2 years when the CNI project is working its way. It'll come in phases, and each phase will allow the city and HACA to submit a new implementation grant, which is a competitive grant. You compete against other jurisdictions around the country. Each time we can go, and the grant award is up to $50 million. It may not be $50 million. You may not need $50 million for the first phase or the second phase. So we talk about these big numbers, $300,000, $400,000 for the total redevelopment, but these things happen in phases over time. So the end game is to start, and you start by clearing the HACA's administrative offices and redeveloping the first phase of housing, moving people from perhaps the most distressed units into that or some other way of making it work. And then you're off to the races, which means that incrementally over a period of maybe 5 to 7 or 8 years, the process is in multi-phase redevelopment. There's ongoing collaboration and detailed planning, and that's why this notion of partnership is necessary. It's going to have to be a lot of good working relationships over a period of almost a decade to get to the end where the last family is in a new unit. But it's also to say that all the details don't have to be figured out instantly, because these are going to be in bite-sized chunks, phases over time. The end game really is to get started on this CNI process, which will result in brand new housing and introduction of mixed income within the community.
Paying rent was the next.
Yeah, are they paying rent?
Yeah, the ones that get online, are they, is
Yeah,
it successful in them?
This was a
'Cause that's
topic
the
of substantial.
fundamental- That's the fiscal problem, is the
Yeah,
rent isn't coming in.
there's a lot of discussion about this. It's very complicated. It appears that folks who have not been paying rent because the units have been unlicensed for considerable time are not apt to rush to the HACA's office with the first month's payment. And HACA is having to strategize about how to do that and through the eviction process. But it takes 3 to 6 months to get a matter in front of the court, and the court has to make a ruling. So I had this naive idea, once the units were licensed, the rent rolls would be going up. But there's a lag time there, and they're in the lag time there. They're trying to get compliance with rent paying.
And then the tension of the legal battle, it's brought a lot of tension. It's really, I know that it's affected my relationship with some of my residents, who have served on the HACA board and all that. So I don't know if we can speak to that, but does that tie your hands a little bit, or?
I suppose it does. I wouldn't venture too far without law
Yeah.
offices
Yeah, okay.
kind of guidance, and that's how we're operating.
Sorry, one more. When you speak of partnership, okay, you give and you give back and all that. Okay, so in response, I would expect HACA. Somehow these units got to where they were because of deferred maintenance. And usually in a rent model, the landlord has, and Rhonda, we dealt with it well at your properties. We wanted them to have maintenance standards. Will they elevate their maintenance standards to include the landscaping and all of that? Will they have will they hire an on-site building engineer to go in and make sure those HVAC units are working correctly, because that's big problem. And will they have a stockpile, and they absolutely should, of smoke detectors and things to fix leaky faucets, maybe even some garbage disposals. I don't know, but and react to these maintenance calls. I was asked, I don't have it. It's like somebody asked me, why are you writing this resolution? Because you don't have any houses. I do. I have Bloomsbury Square, and that's one of the newer ones, and they still don't get maintenance responses. So you have to get that in response from HACA if we're going to talk about a partnership.
Fair enough.
They've got to act like a good landlord, like
Right.
others do.
Right.
Have a weekly newsletter to their residents. What else did we ask them to do, Rhonda? Admiral. Yeah, they just, yeah. Communication with the residents, yeah.
Got it. And also information sharing. I've spent a lot of time on the website reading the reports, the fiscal reports, the budget reports that are provided to the board of, or HACA's board. But it often raises more questions for us, and we're developing a better understanding of what these issues are. For instance, there are a lot of vacant units in HACA's property. There are vacant units that are licensed. I wasn't aware of that. I assumed it was vacant, it would be unlicensed, but there are licensed units they're vacant. So and that opens the door to discussion. Well, why isn't there a family there? Because it takes about 17 tours through before they get a family to.
Really?
Yeah, even though there's compelling reasons for people to be on that list and get there, a lot of people have the same concerns and perspectives on whether to accept a unit as anybody would. Do I feel safe here? Are my kids close enough to the bus stop? Does it seem a little shady over here? Is the maintenance looking nice?
Right.
Is this layout adequate for the way that our family lives? All those are legitimate concerns that all of us share, and they permeate people on the waiting list. And a lot of people will say, I'd rather stay where I am now than settle for this particular unit. I'm sorry you don't have more units for me to look at. Unfortunately, I can't accept that unit. They go back to the waiting list, and so it's a continued process of cycling people through to the units to see if they've got a good match between the unit and the family. So it's not a direct, easy, it becomes available. People have to qualify to have a separate account with BG&E. If they can't qualify and have an account with utilities, it leads to a whole another set of complications.
And also in that partnership, we should have an open book with our budget, I think, and I probably wasn't very kind about it, but, Melissa has always given the impression that, we were holding back money. I mean, we couldn't get money that my colleague wanted for the police. I mean, the budget, the budget is tight, so we need to be more transparent, with Melissa. I mean, since I've been finance chair, I got these direct calls from members of the HACA board saying, how come you're not going to give us, $1 million? I won't name names, but, right? This is like, what, huh?
Right.
So we have to be, more transparent about,
Right.
A partnership. We're not holding any money back from you. So I think I've used up my time, but.
Would if I expanded my answer to one of your previous questions, would that cut into your time? Can I?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So this grant is for $500,000, but there is another $100,000+, which is the CBDG allocation. And traditionally, Teresa Wellman has allocated a share of our annual CBDG allotment to HUD for this very purpose too. So the total amount is well over $600,000. And I also think we have to look.
Our CDBG is going to be earmarked for HACA? And
A small share of it.
Share of
In this
it,
one,
okay.
not, actually, it's a large share of it because as the city has become more affluent, the share from the federal government has decreased. And this year's allocation is only about $247,000.
Oh, it's pathetic,
So
yeah.
close to half of that will go to HACA for housing rehab work.
As it should, as
Yeah.
it should.
The other half will be distributed among various social service organizations dealing with other parts of the CBDG plan that the city adopts. So, well, I guess what I'm saying is it's not just $500,000. And the other point I want to make is that, and this speaks to, I think, Alderman Arnett's comments, $500,000 is not enough. This issue came to a head at the end of the General Assembly last year, and there was not an avenue to provide funding, even if there was political support to do that. And our sense is now that this city commitment can be leveraged to get additional state funding through the next General Assembly to build an approach. And there's also a county role that may come into play here. I know nothing about that, but it would seem to me that under the same theory that the city would be creative, the county might do the same
Right.
thing.
That was what was successful in the Washington DC receivership model, is that it wasn't permanent because it got on, a steady state, so that it got Fed money because it was proven successful. That was my understanding about this, what you spoke of with this $500,000. My understanding would be if this works,
Yeah.
then we could go to the state and the governor and say, we're doing this, but we need more money, and we have evidence.
Right.
I think that's a positive step forward because,
Right.
you have to follow the money.
Exactly.
Although Westmore is cutting stuff, so I'm not sure how much money is actually there. So thank you very, very much for this presentation.
Alderman Savage and Alderman Finlayson again.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So just quick on the lawsuit to the law office. Could we get a work session, closed session scheduled on just to get an update on that in September, October? Because it does make me nervous. If we end up losing that case, we could end up having to pay, who knows, couple million dollars, which would take away from our effort, which we're trying to do today, which is actually getting a solution for the folks. But moving on, the other big issue I want to touch on, I don't want to dwell on, but is for the city manager's office. And that's, I think, an issue we need to talk about as a group at some point, and especially the city manager and mayor's office, is do we really want planning and zoning to be spending all this time on code enforcement work? We lost one director partly because of that, at least my understanding. It was a lot more code enforcement than he anticipated. I'm afraid this might take away from some of your focus on the actual planning and zoning. I think it's entirely appropriate we're working on the CNI, but as far as code enforcement, so I think we've talked about it before, as far as reconsidering something like bringing back the Department of Neighborhood Environmental Programs. I don't know what would make the most sense, but I'm just a little wary of that. I don't know how much time this is taking on your end.
I'm not involved in the day-to-day inspections. My job has been thinking about how to put the right people together to have better outcomes, so more of a strategic approach. But our Division of Inspections and Permits has been essentially leading this. John Manassa and Jeanette, as I mentioned, Mary, the whole group of inspectors. So as a result, it's my time has been mostly devoted to meetings with HACA. Certainly, Teresa Wellman generally handled those. I felt I needed to lend the full support of the office to those meetings to kind of understand what's going on and communicate to cities behind this approach. But I don't see that necessarily being necessary and long term. In essence, this inspection stuff occupies the time of other people than me. But the broader question about time spent on inspections and enforcement, quite a bit. Often it's calls and complaints that make it up to the planning director that involve me in settling issues and managing the inspection process a little bit. But that's not the usual business of what I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just food for thought.
Yeah.
So moving on to the more germane issue, could you clarify, so HACA has approximately 500 total units?
About 550 in its public
550.
housing projects.
Okay. And so they had almost 200 that were at one point that were unlicensed or vacant?
174 that were unlicensed.
Okay. Yeah, that's a lot. I know the director mentioned that there was, in her letter, there was past mismanagement on HACA's end, long time mismanaged. I forget exactly how she worded it, but in any case, so the CNI would, not quite, but maybe almost double that as far as the total number of units, although they would be under private management, right?
Well, not exactly. The CNI would address just 2 of those 4 properties, Eastport Terrace and Harbor House. And there are about 350 there, so we'd be doubling that number. I think there might be 354 there. So we're talking about 700 plus under the CNI.
Still a significant increase. So my concern there would be HACA would presumably have some additional responsibilities coming out of that increase in units. So the money we're talking about for building CNI budget, does that budget include improvements, growth to HACA so they can actually have the capacity to manage these properties, at least their responsibility of it?
Yeah, there's a lot of capacity building that's written into the agreements with the developer. And also the developer and the private initiatives generally takes over more than 50% ownership of the project. They become the property manager. They make the day-to-day decisions. HACA becomes an administrator of the Section 8 program voucher process and deals with other federal requirements, but they're not involved in the day-to-day management of the property anymore under the CNI or the model has been set already. All the properties that they've gone through the conversion with, they've stepped away from management.
But that apparently hasn't helped their bottom line.
Well,
Like they're still struggling, even though they've offloaded properties for the past 15 years. They've been offloading properties.
But they've also offloaded the income from them too. You know, this is a long-term process, and the most challenging properties are the last ones to get through, and the most distressed now, and they're not, they're not particularly income producing.
Yeah. Well, so as far as the number of units, it'd be good to see a list. I think we got this, I think, a couple of years ago, but a list of units that are like what their conditions are, what the issues are, And I'm not on the housing committee, but to my colleagues that are on there, I don't know if this is something you get already, but it might be good to get monthly updates as far as status of the units, status of moving forward. And I'm just thinking it'd be good to know, you said we're getting into the stage where it's the more difficult issues, but what exactly are those more difficult issues? Are they similar amongst units? Like, could we or HACA put something out to bid for contractor to address if there are similar issues? All these issues at the same time, we'd at least have something to start with and something to be able to get our heads around. But right now, it's just like, I feel like we're being asked for not a blank check necessarily, because, well, it kind of is. We're being told, well, we're not being told exactly how much it's going to cost. It's going to cost a lot of money, but we have nothing before us that's actually like, here's what the money's needed for. All we're being told is, we need you to raise $1 million a year. Again, don't know what for. We're being told it's going to cost a lot of money to repair these units. So do we have, that's my big hesitation as far as this, whether it's $500,000 or the alderman saying $250,000, regardless of what it is, where's the actual proposal, so to speak, from HACA that says this is what we need it for, this is when it's going to go to?
That's a fair question, and we can obtain that. We've discussed the outlines of that already, but I'll allow Melissa Maddox Evans to prepare something and submit it to us.
Okay, yeah, because that'd really make me a lot more comfortable with the idea. So, because I think one of the issues, Housing Authority mentioned that we got to this point because in the letter that we were sent, because of the city inspections. And, it's kind of a big loop, right? Because of the city inspections, they haven't been able to get all the units licensed. And then HACA hasn't been able to get the rent because they're not licensed. And then HACA hasn't been able to pay for the improvements and repairs because people aren't able to live in the units because they're not licensed. It's just a big vicious circle there. And so one of the reasons, besides the decades of mismanagement, which is in her words, is because of the inspections. It sounds like you've made some of the improvements that she's been alluding to. Again, we don't know, she didn't give too many specifics, but presumably that's what you're talking about earlier as far as the delay and.
Yeah. So we have made a number of the improvements that will help do this. And the major improvement was creating 120 days notice before a license expires, because that gives substantial time to go through the process, get things fixed before the license expires. So that has, in fact, is leading towards us keeping more units licensed.
Okay.
And as I went through that first example of the Robinwood project that we've gone through, it has worked and will work. But there are other things I think that HACA would like us to do, but we can't do a lot of them. We have to follow the city code, and the city code requires us to apply our code for residential property maintenance. The same code we apply to any housing unit, rental housing unit in the city, is applied to HACA's units. We can improve in the way we communicate things, and that's what we've done substantially, so that their inspectors are more closely aligned with, their maintenance people are more closely aligned with our expectations. We've not always been able to see eye to eye about what actually it takes to resolve a deficiency or resolve a violation. And by involving staff more directly, meeting weekly, being on call to HACA's maintenance, so as soon as an issue is resolved, we're there to license it, or to anticipate an issue. That more dynamic approach is resulting in speedier licensure. So a lot of that is in response to or addresses concerns that Hack has mentioned. But there's some things that we're not proposing to do, like set aside our strict standards in the code.
We can't. I mean, we're getting sued because they're alleging that we're treating people differently as far as what was in the code and
Right.
what we were actually doing. So
That's right. We're not even contemplating that. So, but we're working cooperatively where we can and with flexibility where we can, but we're applying the code faithfully.
Yeah, good. So it sounds like you're trying to make those improvements, which will help and have to help with getting the unit vacancy and the funding issue addressed on that part. But the other issue that we're being told we can do is helping out, again, what we talked about a bit, helping out a hacker with money. So I guess one thing we could do to get some of these details worked out is make this into some kind of, I don't know the best mechanism, some kind of fund transfer, even though, because I know the Alderman Gay clearly had a clear idea in the council when we voted on it, and I think we need to sit down and compare the language of that with what we're proposing to use here. I think it'd be good to get that ironed out in writing somehow, and fund transfer might be the easiest. But again, I think as a part of that conversation, if you could get us that information from Hack as far as, what exactly, how much money exactly they would need for repairs, a list of the repairs, so we can really get our heads around this as far as, what are we going to need to do something next year? Mm-hmm. Is it only going to be a short-term infusion of money? Because ideally, I'm thinking the other big question I have, and I know I don't expect you to have the answer to this, but once we get to the point where the units, they have a high occupancy rate, so not that many vacant, unlicensed units, in my mind, they should have a sustainable financial model at that point, right? If they're bringing in, they're maximizing their income from the rent, is that a sustainable model for them? Because that's ideal, that's our starting point. If it's an unsustainable model at that point, then we need to go and say, okay, either the feds contribute money or we need to contribute money on an annual basis. But until they get to that, I don't know if I'm wording it right, but until we get to that ideal point as far as figuring out, their budget under an ideal model, viable model, yeah. So before anybody's asking us for money every year, we need to make sure their model's viable, and if it's not, exactly how much they need to be subsidized.
I just tell you now, so you're not surprised in the future, the model is not viable, and it's at the end of its course. It is what it is, and I don't think that anyone can make the current model viable, short of a substantial influx of federal monies. HUD's dollars have gone down. Residents living in HACA have become poorer, meaning they pay less under the formulas, and the cost of maintaining the structures has gone up substantially. It's unsustainable. We're at the very fundamental end of the life of these units, and we've got our finger in the dike. That's where we are. The question is, does this $500,000 allow us to leverage support for funding from other agencies as well? HUD has not been, in my view, cooperative with us, has not been responsive to us, and has not shared a pathway or given us guidance, even though we've asked. So your question is valid about it. How would HACA spend this $500,000? This is actually $600,000. I hope that's what the total amount it turns out to be. But for context, if a unit is in fairly difficult circumstances, and particularly if it's been lived in for a long time, it's become vacant and needs to be relicensed, it's going to cost $10,000 to $15,000 to have that unit back online. And with a $500,000 contribution, that's going to result in 50 new units. That's the scale. And you might say, well, it's not that big. And the fact is, it's really not. So this $500,000 doesn't resolve things for HACA. It just keeps the organization going, and while additional funding sources are brought to bear.
Yeah, well, and I get what you're saying, to go back to your other point, as far as the model is not viable, and that's, I presume, and that's why the feds are moving away from that. But if it's not viable, what are we aiming for? We don't have anything defined as far as what we're aiming for, because are we trying to get to a viable model? We're privatizing everything, but we're still being told by HACA that they need us to raise taxes to pay for some money for them year after year after year. So I don't know I feel like if it's not a viable model, we need to go to the state. And you said you're already talking about the county, but frankly, the state's having a symposium on housing on August 1st. I was just looking at that this morning. So that's next week, right? NML's putting it together. The housing secretary of the state's going to be there. They need to know about this, because, I mean, when their legislation they introduced and passed, no support for jurisdictions who they're asking to add all this housing, no support to make this a viable model. And that's the fundamental flaw in the state's thinking right now with this housing. And so we need to all get on the same page somehow, but as a part of that, we need to get the housing authority, we need to establish a baseline for them where they're collecting as much rent as they can, and then figure out how are we going to fill that gap and make a viable model. And that's, we can't create, like, the housing director wants us to look at new fees, new taxes, but we've exhausted pretty much all the fees we have at our disposal right now. We would have to get some kind of permission from the state to do something else, or we'd have to get permission from our taxpayers to raise taxes, and to do that we would need a lot more documentation and support. But I really think the state's got it. So hopefully you or somebody else can go to the housing and make that symposium, make that point next week. I think that's a big part of the puzzle here.
Yeah, I think it is too. And I want to be clear that at some point, and it's not very far beyond the reasonable boundaries, I get into deeper water than I'm, able to swim in. The financial side is something I'm still learning about. Don't take advice from me on the financial side, and I'm going to try to stay away from that. But I'm giving you this sense that conditions are not sustainable the way they are now, and that's why the focus is on the C&I and expediting redevelopment. It's so critical to move that process forward, and that's why we're hosting HACA in our offices to start doing that, and we'll be working with the mayor's office, city manager, to bring ideas to the council and work this financing plan and align that with the developer's plan. I mean, there's a lot of sort of development type of work that has to take place, and the sooner the better, because we're at the end game of Eastport Terrace and Harbor House. And the question now is, how do we manage this in a humane way to sustain the lives of the folks that live there and stay consistent with our code in terms of inspections? And that has to be a multi-party effort, not just city.
Yeah, and I think, we may want to have another one of these with the housing authority, because I really do want to know what the end game is. Based on the past 15, 20 years, we've been moving away from the HACA model and towards privately managed properties. Essentially, it seems to me we're working to a model which is phasing out HACA entirely. And if that's the point, if that's the case, then fine, but let's be upfront about that and figure out how are we actually going to dissolve that and make some other new model that's going to work. I just don't know. Honestly,
well, that model is in effect. That is the model, and that's the model of other jurisdictions. And so HACA is stepping away from property management, stepping away from public housing in its current form. It is a public-private and privately-driven, managed set of entities, and HACA becomes more of a manager of the process and the connection between the federal dollars and the businesses operating these developments. That's the future. So we're well on that path. And I was reading documents from 20 years ago, and it was articulating this pathway. And this wasn't new back then. It was called Hope 6, and many jurisdictions were on the ball. Annapolis lagged behind 20 years ago. We weren't doing that. So we find ourselves now with these two particular properties where the obsolescence has become dire, I guess you would say. But understanding how HACA would utilize that $500,000 in a meaningful way is really important. And we'll get the categories of project types and some ideas about what it takes to get these units licensed. We do have all the licensed, unlicensed units. We know precisely what the issues are. We have them all documented. Some of them point to severe, expensive work. Some are still relatively easy, but they're not simply as fixing light bulbs and electrical outlets. They're electrical, they're mold remediation, they're plumbing, they're bathroom models, cabinets in the kitchens, and leaky plumbing, wet foundations. These are expensive things. So,
Thank you. Alderman Finlayson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I asked Caitlin to find a presentation from Melissa, Ms. Maddox-Evans, which gave us the exact information Alderman Savage was seeking about the number of units, those that, when I came on the council, we had 1,104 units. That number was imprinted on my head, as Alderman Arnett will attest to, by Robert Eads. He never let us forget, and he was always trying to safeguard against losing those units. And then Annapolis Gardens came online as the first public-private partnership. And so we lost 150, but I assume they're listed as Section 8 properties now as opposed to HUD. And then the same thing with College Creek Terrace and Oberry Court. So my last number in my head was 780, but today you're telling us that it's 515 units.
550.
550 units. So, I'm sorry?
Because of Newtown.
Because of,
Every time we go
that's right, Newtown was the most recent, the one I would forget. Not intentionally though, but yes. And so with CNI, do we lose all of those units, and do they become Section 8 also? Or however it's classified?
Yeah, essentially, they become redeveloped and operated under the Section 8 program of federal housing laws. So they were principally through a voucher program. They still will be available to the same families that live in HACA's properties now, will still be eligible to live in the new units. There's no question about that. It's just a different program that's has a private initiative in terms of running private management.
I'm not sure if we get if we have the information, whether we get it, as far as how those Section 8 properties, those public-private partnerships, are doing as far as their licensures and their inspections.
Yeah.
Has it benefited the residents by going into those partnerships over the years? Because what I keep hearing is what we're looking at now is not sustainable. So, what we're not talking about at length is coming up with an opportunity, a program that's going to encourage people to pay their rent. If Melissa was able to collect all the rent that is due her, where would she be and how sustainable would she be?
So I won't answer that question in any detailed way, but I will say that those Oberry Court and the other projects that have been transitioned into the Section 8 model are doing remarkably well, both with respect to inspections, as you might expect, because they're relatively new. So if there are any inspection issues, they're generally easy to be fixed. They're not structural or systems-related issues. And their occupancies range from 93 to 98%, which is enviable for any private development. They're essentially 100% occupied. Maybe they cycle through, have turnover from month to month, but they're doing remarkably well. So the model works. And again, it's the same residents that lived in the communities are eligible to live in them under the new model. So there is clearly a benefit in terms of newer quality, modernized housing that's managed in a different way, where expectations for paying rent are set from the very beginning, where the private managers have a very serious legal team to enforce laws on paying rent, who discuss in very candid ways with legal aid and other advocates that we're going to the mat to ensure our occupants pay the rents and stay current with our programs, because it's fundamental to keeping our operation sound, is that everyone's playing to the same tune. In other words, they are more successful in front of the judges at district court than HACA's been. And HACA, as the inventory has whittled down to the remaining 4, has become the housing of last resort, as a matter of what I'm beginning to understand, judicial philosophy. And rent paying has become something that is difficult to enforce. Again, 28% last month.
And I heard you say that, which is appalling to me.
Yeah.
And I have to wonder if she made the statistics known. She's told us, but if she makes them known to the residents to say, we have this shortfall because people are not paying their rent and we can't maintain our units because we have this shortfall, maybe there's a resident pressure that would be, placed on the residents who aren't paying their rent. Maybe the blame will be placed, and I know that could backfire.
There currently, the number of unpaid rent has reached close to $800,000 at this point. And they report on it at every board meeting, the HACA board meeting reports on it. So they track it, and you listen to their meetings, they detail this phenomenon.
Well, she should send a letter to them like the one she sent about the pool. I should have started with my last question, or my first comment, was to thank you and to acknowledge the process that you put in place for the inspections, because clearly it's made a difference, and I'm sure going forward it's going to make a considerable difference. So I just wanted to commend you on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alderman Pindell-Charles.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Director Jakubiak, I have to applaud you. And nothing should be lost on the day that you started here, which was September the 11th. I'll leave it at that. But you have done an amazing job shepherding us through that comp plan and now taking this on. You can't cut a break, I don't think. But the more you give us, the more we're gonna ask of you. You know that. But anyway, I'm gonna leave that alone. I think something that should be said out loud, and this is nationwide, not symptomatic of Annapolis, the systematic decline and how this HUD system has worked over the past, I say 30 years, has been unkind to people. We spend a lot of time on other things, but I think it needs to be said out loud. The people who have been caught up in this, it's abhorrent, it's appalling. Some of us here have seen it happening and could do really nothing about it because we weren't in positions to do anything about it. And so I'm gonna make that statement, that the ball has been dropped in many ways, but this is a nationwide problem, not just ours. But that doesn't mean we may have been able to do something better until now. So I'm going to say that. But I'm curious, and I'm sure we have looked at possibly other jurisdictions on how they have handled some of these issues, including the payment of rent or the non-payment of rent. I'm skittish about children, I guess, being displaced. I'm concerned about adults, but the displacement of children and the effect that it has on them and the trauma of having to move from school to school and that sort of thing, or even parents moving from job to job and going into cities and towns where they have no family to support them, and then there are even more problems to try to fix. With that being said, are we looking at other jurisdictions as to how they're handling some of the things, including the rental payment issue?
We haven't here internally on the issue of rent paying, because perhaps we consider that a HACA's operational management question, not ours. But we are looking at other jurisdictions about their housing approaches. And the transition has been made to the Section 8 program generally in other jurisdictions. And Montgomery County, for instance, is leading the way there. And by the way, as an aside, when the chief financial officer of HACA sat here and said, you know, other jurisdictions like Fairfax County have done 1 penny on the sales tax, he wasn't saying that this council ought to consider that. He was just saying that for HACA, he was saying that jurisdictions have talked about dealing with the housing issue generally by having dedicated funding sources, so that funding, even in his view, because I checked him with that, wouldn't be a funding source for HACA. It would be a commitment to dealing with the mission of affordable housing, which HACA's chief staff people are really committed to. It's a ministry, really, in some level, for the folks that work in that field. And we know that there's a fundamental issue with housing affordability within the city, within the state. And I know Alderman Arnett and I have talked about this a lot. But for those folks who make 60% or less of the area median income, or don't make money, and folks in HACA, some people don't earn income. They are facing substantial hardships, and there's no option short of a homeless shelter for that population. And these are residents who are longtime residents of the city in some cases. And so cities and towns and counties, particularly the more urbanized counties, have developed an approach to dealing with housing. And it often means a government approach where the private sector and the public sector are working closely, just like that has been evolving here in the city for 20 years. And we have the MPDU program, we have the Housing Trust Fund, you have a community development director, Teresa Wellman, who will be replaced with a new person soon. All these tools in our toolbox will be marshaled as well to support the housing picture. And if at any point we feel that it's important to us to bring to you a recommendation to find a funding source, just like we did with respect to trees or critical area mitigation or the funding for Downtown Annapolis Partnership, all these other things, we would do that. We bring a recommendation and go through the proper procedure and ask you to consider it as elected officials and give us direction. We're not there yet, but we do think that, and I think in part you hired me to address this housing issue, and it's not just a HACA issue. HACA's, as I mentioned, 530 units, they have less than 3% of the housing units within the city. So actually 2.6% of the housing units. It's a very small share of and we have affordability needs that extend well beyond HACA.
When Director Maddox Evans was here before us, the question was asked as to why she had not come before us to present her quarterly report, and her response was because she wasn't invited. Well, I'm going to put it out there. Should be a perpetual invitation every 3 months. whatever 3 months, whatever third month we decide on, that should be perpetual, and we should put that in writing and etched in stone. And how you come to us, we can determine that at a later time, whether it's every 3, 4, whatever you feel is comfortable. But obviously, there was some miscommunication, and I'll leave it at that. But we need an etched in stone month for her to come before us. We don't need to hear that explanation anymore. Thank you.
Thank you. Alderman Savage.
Just real quick comment on that. I do agree. I just want to make the point that I think those meetings should be work sessions because they need a lot of conversation, I'm thinking. I don't think that'd be good to tack on the beginning of our council meetings, but I agree with the underlying point.
I think we hit a wall on that for a little while, remember? We had a regular schedule and then it got a little ugly and we pulled back. But I agree with both of you. Alderman Annette.
I just want to repeat what I think is a very profound statement that the director made. The residents are poorer, HUD's support is dwindling, and the buildings are reaching the end of their useful life and are more and more expensive to maintain. That's a very stark statement, but I think it's very accurate characterization of what we're dealing with. And it is our problem. These are our residents, and we need to figure out ways that we can address this. But that is a sobering statement. So I don't know if I thank you for it or not, but it's really important to recognize that.
Thank you. And I just want to go on the record here, Director. So in my view, around 75% of the units are now licensed.
That's right.
And then you said last month, so we're working towards solutions here. Mm-hmm. If we could use 600,000, we could, and we did complete retrofits at 10,000, we get 60 units back online, nearly over half of what we need to get us down for 25% less to around 10, 13%, something like that, right? We have the ability to do that with this money. There's other issues next year, of course. Right. But at 75% of the units licensed, only 28% of the residents are paying rent. So the rent collection is not something that this council has an ability to affect. And clearly the court system understands that if you do evict people from this housing of last resort, it is homeless shelters, and we don't even have homeless shelters to send people to. So then we have people also being offered units that have decided not to take those units, even though they are vacant and they're licensed. So it's such a complex problem. And when everyone asks what the end game is, I mean, we've been working towards the end game. Aubrey Court is a brand new rebuild, right? And this council saw Newtown through, and we saw Wilburn Estates open from start to finish in less than 4 years. From when we went to Mike Bush and asked for money, and then they effectively started those contracts. They built them, and people have been there over a year now, between a year and 2 years. So we have seen through a big housing piece. But so there's Aubrey, Newtown, they've selected the developer for Bloomsbury, they've selected the developer for Robinwood, and so the last one is the one that's in front of us now, and that's CNI. And CNI is going to be amazing, and it's going to be a legacy for this council that we all should be very proud of that turnaround. The thing we have to do is accelerate it, because exactly what you said, the money is getting less and the buildings are getting older. What do you think that formula, this is where we are today, So, I think we're so lucky to have you in place. I did want to clarify though, if we get the CNI 50 million, or if they get, that 50 million goes to the developer, right? I mean, the developer.
The grant, the grant goes to the development. It goes into the development pro forma as a income source.
And if the developer brings 200 million to the table or whatever, that too is matching, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's not up to the city. And for all the ones that I just named, the city have never put cash into those developments. And you've seen through a lot, right? And before us, they've seen through a lot. So the end game is that HACA will be managing the vouchers from a much smaller site, and that all these private-public partnerships that are now Section 8 and no, only there won't be a Section 9, any Section 9 properties. So they'll have third-party management companies that are being effective right now. Annapolis Gardens is a very efficiently run, and I could go throughout the city to say, and even with the problems in the beginning with Wilbourn Estates, those 4 units are back online now and they're 100% tenanted, and it is a very different situation over there than what we inherited when some of us came in. So just a huge thank you for that clarification. I think we really, really appreciate the work that you're doing, and it's definitely not easy, but we're lucky to have you. Thank you. All right.
Can I just thank Kate for scrambling to get this together before we broke for August break? So thank you, Kate.
Thanks. And I just want to say, we did call HACA up. We did get the county in the room. We did get the state in the room. And the only people that came up with any solutions were right here. Cliff has been lent to us. Sure. Yeah.
Hi everyone, Kate, Chief of Staff to the Mayor, Kate Pettit. I did just want to, that point I think is a really important one. We have partners in our state and federal, partners who want to come to the table to help, but there's no obvious way for them to do it at the moment. And they can't just put money into operational, budgets. So I do think this plan may well give us the foundation to pull in the assistance, and you referenced that to Alderwoman Tierney. So I feel that's a very hopeful basis if we can pull that framework together.
Thank you. Thanks, Kate. All right. Meeting adjourned. Thank you, everybody.